Okay, welcome everyone and good afternoon. I'm Christy Kochak, Director of Alumni Relations and also a proud Roosevelt alum. So thank you all for joining us today in celebration of Roosevelt's 75-year anniversary. We're thrilled to bring you today's webinar on multicultural diversity and intercultural management. As a university who was founded on the principles of equality and inclusion, this topic is of course very important for us to discuss and bring to our community. And Dr. Robinson-Easley, who I will introduce in just a minute, will be leading today's webinar, and we're very grateful to have her here today. Just a quick reminder, I ask that everyone just please keep their mic muted throughout the webinar just to ensure great quality for all. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the hour, but feel free to use the chat box to ask your questions throughout the webinar. I know sometimes when questions come up, if you don't write them down, you'll lose them. So feel free just to enter your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be sure to get to them as we wrap up and turn to the Q&A. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Christopher Ann Robinson-Easley. She's a seasoned executive and academic. The first half of her career was in the corporate business sector, where she worked in healthcare, human resources management, organization development, and operations management in leadership and management roles. Prior to moving her consulting practice into a full-time career, she worked in higher education and was tenured and promoted to the rank of full professor in management. Her work is internationally recognized, and she is an extensively published author and academic. I just learned a little bit ago that she actually did a webinar in Saudi Arabia on one of her books, which was just really interesting to learn about. She served in the academic administrative positions of program coordinator, director, dean, assistant provost, and vice president for academic and student affairs. Dr. Robinson-Easley returned to the Academy in 2019 as a visiting faculty member in the Walter E. Heather College of Business here at Roosevelt. And beginning this academic year, she is continuing to serve the students of Roosevelt University as a full clinical professor for organizational leadership. She also operates a boutique consulting firm, Enlightening Management Consultants, Inc., and is a professional speaker, All-American Speakers, and writer. So Dr. Easley, again, an honor to have you here today. I will go ahead and turn the mic over to you so you can get started.
Sounds great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. Really a pleasure. I want to thank my students that are here supporting me. I also want to thank Drs. Carolyn Wiley and Paul Wellen for taking time, especially over the weekend, to kind of take a look at what I'm going to talk about today and say, yay, nay, change this, do this. You know, that's the thing and the beauty of this university. We really do support one another, and I appreciate it. I really do. I'm going to get started by sharing the screen so that we can jump straight into the presentation. And as Christy said, if you don't mind, it would be a little bit easier because there's a lot at the end that I also want to make sure that we have the opportunity to cover. And then afterwards, we'll have Q&A. Well, Christy provided you with an overview of my background. What I wanted to do was take a few seconds and just talk about an overview of my experiences in the fields of diversity and intercultural management, which inform much of what I have written about over the past few years. A significant percentage of my years in HR were spent in organizations that had very challenging diversity issues. Over the years, my roles and responsibilities included designing and implementing sensitivity and diversity training initiatives, which colleagues who were doing similar work, and I found, were initiatives that had very, very short-term effects in our respective organizations. Over the years that I spent in higher education, I was asked many times to design and deliver training programs on diversity, again, in some very challenging organizations. For example, a colleague and I were tasked to provide training to over 1,000 people in less than a month in one of the larger state organizations that had just undergone a consent decree. And you can only imagine walking into an environment like that was beyond challenging. Similar requests have been made or were made through my consulting practice to train and provide interventions. And for years, I taught intercultural management in the French Caribbean, which in and of itself was also very challenging because, believe it or not, the varying islands in that area of France had their own issues of diversity and interculturalism. And I worked with various groups there in the French Caribbean regarding diversity issues and how their issues were negatively impacting the country's economy. Throughout my years as a researcher, there were many lessons I learned, lessons which led me to even critique my earlier work. But I really do believe what prompted me to change the most was my walk through seminary and the opportunity I had to really delve deeply into understanding what were issues relative to global social justice. It was those lessons that led me to write this book beginning in 2013, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. So what did I learn? In 2014, I wrote, many recent events in our world caused me to expand how I posit the concept of difference and diversity. Even as I continued to write this book, there were many, many things going on during that time. Trayvon Martin here in the United States, issues that were going on in various international environments where people were just revolted. When we look at difference from the lens of valuing and loving humanity, however, I believe we can significantly move beyond the need to engage in varying diversity and intercultural management strategies that over the years have made questionable differences on how we globally interact with one another. I further stated that valuing diversity, managing intercultural relations, and all the other references we attribute to evoking acceptance of one another in our global society cannot override a fundamental concept. That being, when we learn to value our humanity without process descriptors, we can work towards valuing one another simply from a lens of love. And as Mahatma Gandhi said, love is the strongest force that the world possesses, and yet it is the humblest imaginable. Why was this an important learning? It didn't matter if I were working through the concepts of diversity and inclusion or intercultural management. When you begin to deconstruct and understand why national and international issues prevailed, the reasons could be very simply relegated to people not valuing those individuals or classes of people who are being marginalized, whether it's via violence or totally inappropriate work environments, when corporations move their operations overseas, particularly into third world countries. Yet, there are ways that we can bring forth change via new paradigms, which are addressed by the model that was published in my book in 2014. Therefore, our learning objectives for this webinar will focus on this model and why it is relevant on a global basis. A model that is designed to move people beyond the concepts and constructs associated with managing diversity and towards strategies that will focus on valuing humanity. So we will briefly review some of the diversity and intercultural management issues that are negatively impacting our world, understand the issues and the need for change within our personal domain, and define the steps that can be taken to position you and your organizations as critical change agents that can move us towards valuing humanity and, equally important, healing our divided environment. So what are some of the foundations of the model? Simply, better understand the self as the first critical step. However, as we'll see, and even in the descriptions I have, it's abbreviated because this step is very extensive. How do you engage in personal transformation that can inspire the hearts of others? And looking at briefly the 4 major steps in this model that help an organization position itself and its individuals to bring forth change. But it's also important that we understand that these issues do not just reside within a traditional business context. And across many organizational contexts, people are tired of feeling marginalized. And the foundations for each step of the model are grounded in the literature. When an individual begins to examine their personal values, paradigms, and their abilities to be an effective change agent, that initial examination can be painful because it's at some level, everyone holds some level of bias. But it's the movement through that pain that has the ability to result in the strength that we need to carve out a different world. The interpersonal dynamics of the model draw upon the research in multiple publications of Dr. Robert Quinn, who is the Margaret Elliott Tracy Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan, Ross School of Business. His research and writing focuses on purpose, leadership, culture, and change. Dr. Quinn is one of the leaders in the field of positive organizational scholarship and a co-founder for the Center for Positive Organizations at the University of Michigan. He's in the top 1% of professors cited in the organizational behavior textbooks. He's published 18 books, of which I use many of them in the classes that I teach. And his book, Deep Change, is a long-term bestseller that is internationally widely used. Equally important for me on a personal level, I was blessed to have Dr. Quinn as a professor in my doctoral program. And he really laid the foundation for a lot of the critical questions I began to ask as I was working through this area of work. The remaining steps of the model are also grounded in the organizational change strategies of appreciative inquiry and discourse analysis. Now, today we won't have time to examine the underpinnings of it, but I would highly recommend that you look at the literature if you can, and just, for example, Google appreciative inquiry. I think particularly in today's challenging environments, being able to understand how to work from a focus of positivity versus a negative orientation is very critical to being able to strengthen us. And as we will see, as we walk through these steps, the strategies focus on authentic conversations and action steps that will result in healing and systemic change. What's the value proposition of it? It doesn't embrace programs. What I learned throughout my years in the corporate business sector and as I began to engage in training and development initiatives in diversity and inclusion and intercultural management, is programmatic initiatives do not have long-term sustainability. It does not embrace hiring people or looking at quotas or management/employee development strategies and/or training. This model embraces people talking with one another about their feelings, their dreams, their desires, and their concerns. And what we will find in much of the literature regarding the power of language and linguistic analyses and deconstruction is that constructive conversations ensue that can have the potential, just by having the conversation, to begin to remove barriers and bond people from a very different level of consciousness. And you're not going to be able to get everybody on board. Over the years, what I found was that a critical mass of people can be the catalyst for driving significant change. And I've also learned that when you engage a critical mass of people, others who may be sitting on the fringes will oftentimes get involved. The versatility of this model is of such is that individuals have the power to do the same with this model on a smaller scale. And as an individual, you can begin to evoke a change via the components by simply engaging people around you. And more importantly, the self in venues where you have influence and input. Leadership is not defined by the size of your organization or the scope of your authority. True leaders, no matter where they reside, whether in the corporate boardroom, heading up a little league baseball team, or heading a church ministry, they will appreciate, understand, and value the individual threads that make up our vast oneness. For example, for me as an educator, I can introduce students in the classroom to the guiding practices of this model. But you can also do the same with your friends, your colleagues, family, and any other groups with whom you interact. The failure to respect the concepts of diversity and inclusion, and equally important, valuing humanity, is an international issue. And what I would like to do is just take a couple of minutes to briefly look at what are some of the issues by first starting with the global community. Over 16 years ago, the United Nations, through the Global Compact, identified 10 principles that required international attention and remediation. A majority of these 10 principles address fundamental human rights. Yet we sit 16 years later, and far too many of the issues have experienced little change. Yet also, the number of businesses, NGOs, and civil society organizations and their respective leaders who are partnering with the United Nations on the Global Compact years later are small numbers compared to available worldwide organizations. What the architects of the Global Compact saw was that it was not just developing countries that were impacted, but developed nations as well. And of the 10 principles, those that specifically address a need to respect humanity include supporting and respecting the protection of human rights, making sure that businesses are not complicit in human rights abuses, eliminating all forms of forced and compulsory labor, abolishing child labor, and eliminating discrimination with respect to employment and occupation issues. In addition to the issues identified within the Global Compact, there's an inability to value and respect humanity and our diversities, evidenced by ethnic cleansing of far too many people on a global basis, which is being enacted by a few that deem these groups as inferior. Geopolitical decisions that are negatively changing the balance and the safety and security of many global citizens. Country leaders who are continuing to discuss which countries will allow displaced refugees to enter and stay, with the travesty that countries, many countries, are unfortunately using the crises of displacement as bargaining chips in the gamesmanship of geopolitics. There is a violence that is associated with ethnic cleansing as people are displaced from their homelands, thus increasing the growth of refugee camps. We're looking at inhumane conditions of displaced children, particularly here in the United States. We all read about it, saw about it. from their families and their placement in camps. And that child labor practices on a global scale that interfere with a child being able to pursue an education continues. Unfortunately, as a result, far too many children are rendered unable to develop to his or her potential, actions that are ultimately going to impact the intellectual capital of our global villages. And just the continuation of child labor is delimiting so many other opportunities. And the other thing that is horrific is that people here in this country talked about, did many actions to protest the inhumane conditions of displaced children from their families and the camps that they were in, but yet that situation still is an issue, to the point that most recently there was articles that addressed the fact that over 600 of those children still to this day their parents cannot be found. And that was right here in the United States. Here in our country, while fighting this global pandemic, protests over ongoing racial issues have ensued. In addition to an already heightened awareness and concern regarding perceived police brutality towards African-American men, the recording of an African-American man being apprehended by and subsequently dying at the hands of a police officer sparked racial protests and the resurrection of the Black Lives Movement across the United States. And as a result, the United States protests erupted into a level of violence that has not been seen in years. Multiple businesses were shut down, businesses that are critical to daily functioning because they were trashed by people who expressed a level of anger by mass numbers of people that surpassed what we have seen again in years. The protest was a show of solidarity with our friends in the US, but also a united stand against the endemic racism, which is a global threat. These protests were enjoined by international communities of at least 24 cities across 5 continents. What we saw was from London to Pretoria to Sydney, people took to the streets to express the need for police reform and racial equality, many holding signs that read Black Lives Matter, while others kneeled. And at some of the protests, marchers stood in silence for the amount of time that Floyd struggled to breathe while police officers detained him. During the first week of January in 2020, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres appeared worried and stated, "The new year has begun with our world in turmoil." While a news article that addressed how many people across the globe rang in the 2020 New Year and decade stating, "New York dropped its traditional crystal-encrusted ball to ring in 2020 in a packed Times Square after crises-marked celebrations in other countries ended. A year of worldwide upheaval that saw strike hit Paris, welcomed the new decade with fireworks, and London's Big Ben rang after a long restoration. The billions around the world cheered in 2020 after a tumultuous year dominated by demonstrations calling for political revolt and action on climate change. One person in particular saying, "I'm not optimistic about the future." Why? I don't think anybody thinks the world is in a good place. And I think that's one of the defining things of the decade. There's a sort of pessimism that we see that even our pop songs are set. And that was in January 2020 as the new year was ringing in. And as I've just shown with the protests that ensued during the summer, it's only become worse. There clearly is a need for identifying new strategies for making a systemic difference in our world that's going to move us beyond value, or move us towards, valuing humanity and beyond managing diversity. So here we sit in the middle of a pandemic that is exacerbating multiple issues, including how people who have already faced marginalization are being treated. Yet, as serious as the most current issues are, globally, people have been hurting for a very, very, very long time, despite the hard work that is being done by present-day change agents. Equally important, President-elect Joe Biden has stressed the need for healing in this country. And I think it's safe to assume that the need for healing is a global need. The real question is how. And in the how, where is our ability to inculcate healing? Because what we're dealing with, unfortunately, is a loss of trust in many entities that have originally been developed to bring forth change. Our changing world calls for people from all walks of life: business, education, government, social service, NGOs, and local communities who are willing to become transformational leaders, be it in your home, community, or whatever type of organization you're in. We each have a responsibility to begin to understand, conceptualize, and act in a way that can significantly alter what we are currently witnessing in our world. Governments have clear responsibilities for creating aggressive change-oriented action, as do corporate business leaders who have the resources to produce deep change strategies that will critically address how we view and value humanity. Because when you start to break it down, a lot of the issues that we see in third world countries where people are being mistreated are brought on by corporations that are bringing their businesses there, not paying people a sustainable wage, not allowing them to work in safe environments, and that list goes on. Yet, when transformational leaders embrace humanity and help ameliorate the changes people face, they will also help our world morph to new and far more productive levels. Actions which can result in important value propositions for everyone. So how do we become successful in bringing forth the change? You need to have a vision and how that change can look like. You need a roadmap for change in order to understand, internalize, and shift the relational boundaries of the systems that you either interact with or control. And you need to understand the connectivity of these systems in order to be able to identify, develop, and implement a change strategy. For example, while many organizations may embrace the concept of diversity within their organizational structures, within those structures may also lie structural barriers. Equally important, when you understand your personal vision and how you can contribute, even if it's in small steps, it is the collectivity of individual actions that begin to evoke significant change. For example, when I teach ethics, my students get so frustrated and they'll say, "Doc, how can we make a difference?" And I give them the example that I was taught years ago. If you throw a pebble in a pond, you make a small wave. And the more pebbles that are thrown into that pond, the bigger those waves can become. So it's not like something is so overwhelming that we can't do it. We have to be able to look at what is it that we can do individually. Unfortunately, the need for a different model is critical because what, again, many of us in the field have found is that traditional modes of diversity strategies, such as training, new recruitment initiatives, and efforts towards assessing the diversity culture, focus either on the individual or a very small part of the organization's culture and systems. Researchers for years have posited that to instill diversity as a way of life within your organizations, the entire organizational system must be changed, which begins with those leading the organization. In other words, you have to begin to deconstruct and analyze what are your paradigms that you operate on and how do they impact the work that you do. Each of us has that potential to change the world. But as Dr. Quinn has said in many of his writings, many seldom take on the challenge because they're afraid. Fear can blind you to the possibilities of excellence and making a difference. Yet, those who are willing to transform the self, and that transformation is going to have many iterations. You just don't start looking at yourself once and then say, oh, okay, I'm done. It's a constant modality of looking at the self, compared and contrasted to the venues in which we're operating and say, where do I need to make a difference? In me first. So how do I realize the vision? How do I ensure that I'm working from a moral system? How do I develop and abide by core values? Making sure that I'm behaving with integrity, being self-authorizing, confronting my need for change, learning by doing, being comfortable and valuing complexity, and at the end of each cycle, understanding that you are engaging in personal rebirths. And those rebirths can be very, very exciting. So let's take a look at the model. There are multiple levels of change that are required. What's critical about this model is step one. So we're going to examine step one. At the core, the organization's leadership has to self-reflect. And what does that mean? You have to begin to examine the assumptions that you make, while also increasing your sensitivity and openness to the conditions of the world. Understand that if we're ever going to reflect accurately and change how we view, treat, and inspire people, that change is going to have to start with people who have a commitment to bringing about change. Personal transformations can morph through your respective organizational venues. You individually have the ability, once you begin to engage in your self-examination, to inspire the hearts and souls of others to change as well. And in doing so, you become a living symbol of change. People who are around you become attracted to your energy in such a manner that they begin to empower themselves. Actions which lead to emergent organizing, a change in the system that no one leads in the traditional sense. Ask yourself the uncomfortable question. Do your competencies and skills align with the critical core competencies of people who can effectively transform, even if it's on a small scale? Assess, where do you stand in your values and ideals regarding deep change and your commitment to social responsibility? How do people around you, people in your family, your organizations, your communities, view you as a leader? Do they see you as someone committed to valuing humanity and wanting to bring about transformational change? Or are there gaps that you need to address? For example, if an organizational leader can't invoke an egalitarian environment within the domain of all the geographies in which the company may operate, how then can that person even remotely stand that he or she can lead in diversity strategies within your national domain. Understand your personal views regarding the organizational issues of unresolved problems in modernity. How do you identify and accept poverty and understand its stratification along lines of race, ethnicity, and gender? And when you examine the global issues, do you understand the connecting lines? In other words, do you view the world from a systems perspective and interdisciplinary level? Do you understand the issues in your region and how your organization does or does not impact those issues? In other words, do you really understand the connecting lines? Do you understand the intersection between leadership, culture, power, and ethical decision-making in an organizational environment when examining diversity, intercultural management, and social justice issues, as well as opportunities? Is your daily language one of hope and importing personal power upon the people with whom you interact? Or is it a language of fatalism? The well-known educator Paulo Freire in 1997 rendition of his book said that there are those who articulate hopefulness not out of stubbornness, but out of an existential concrete imperative. Do we really understand our existential concrete imperatives? And do we daily lead a life of hopefulness, which is inspiring to others? Do you understand and agree with the proposition that there is an important link between deep change at the personal level and deep change at the organizational level? Because when people look at you and they see that you can't make that deep change, your actions, particularly the unspoken ones, are going to be negative influences on your ability to drive change at the organizational level, regardless of how you identify the organization. And again, one of the things I want to make sure that I reiterate as we talk about change in the context in which you are making it, I'm not just relegating this to corporations. It can be educational institutions, it could be a community, it could be within your own family structure. Do you believe that to make deep personal change may require your developing new paradigms, a new perspective of the self, one that is more effectively aligned with today's realities? Step 2 takes that interpersonal conversation and analysis further. It's not enough for a leader to go through a self-reflection process. Once you've gone through your individual process, the outcomes, the positivity of the outcomes, as well as the pain, it's then time to collectively come together with the leaders of your organization. Again, however you describe your organizational context, to share your insights. By sharing those insights, you're also sharing perceptions of how meaning can occur within the organization. The praxis and assumptions you believe have impacted how that organization views difference, and the personal challenges to the organizational behaviors you and your team have allowed that may impact the organization's ability to move valuing humanity to a different level. In this step, you also want to be able to introduce the concept of how do you come together and take this beyond just your conversation, but also to a larger organizational context. So as you talk through your personal perceptions of how the organization's culture is defined and encouraged, what communication patterns do you see existing or not existing? And what are the venues in which power evolves? You're the leadership. What are you allowing in that context? Importantly, also within step 2 is that you cannot allow those issues and those conversations to become events. So, for example, if you look at the real reasons why sweatshops occur, child labor issues emerge, women are treated less than men. I mean, today's environment, we still have women in same jobs making 30% or less than their male counterparts. And that list can go on. As the organization's leader, you're going to have to adequately deconstruct the dynamics of power and the perceived privilege at all levels within the organizational structure. And equally important to understand that people do not like to give up power and privilege. So in this conversation with your team, you have to begin to authentically talk about what are the alternative paradigms of more socially appropriate behaviors and how those behaviors can and uplift people. The third step is engaging the organization in a dialogue that explores their concept of humanity, their treatment within the organization, and overall how they view the organization with respect to how humanity is valued. In other words, people should be able to come together in groups and express how they see the organization constructing its reality. Now, for those of us that are trained in organization development, these type of whole systems change processes are not overwhelming, are not unrealistic, and can engage significant numbers of people in an appropriately facilitated modality. Those constructs can construct and produce change. The concept and of the conversation itself brings about alterations in non-linguistic internal human states or environmental states. You want to introduce the critical components of discourse analysis also, where the organization will begin to understand what themes are coming out. For example, I was working in New Orleans right before Katrina in an organization that had committed itself to making significant change in several of the critical communities in New Orleans. But yet, while we were really moving towards strategies of understanding what it was to appreciate change in those organizational environments, the conversations began to move towards where people are articulating those people, those situations. And we had to take a step back. What does that mean? Because that conversation in and of itself suggested a perception of superiority over the people that they were committed to helping. So again, understand where's the themes that are emerging? How do you engage in that thematic analysis of what that may mean? In your dialogue, explore the concept of humanity. In other words, how do you see the organization constructing the reality? You're gathering organizational members together via using a whole systems venue. And what people will see is if the leadership has authentically engaged in their processes as defined in the first two steps, that's going to be conveyed through how they interact with one another, as well as their nonverbal cues and their receptivity to understanding the organizational members' input. In other words, they're not going to be quick to dismiss people's truths. So we'll work towards engaging in a deep listening process. We call it in OD polyphonic listening, in order to better understand and identify through a thematic analysis where opportunities may really lie. The utilization of step 4 of appreciative inquiry is critical. AI can serve then as the catalyst for bringing forth a new vision as to how humanity should be respected and what that resulting language should look like. The shifting of the dialogue is powerful because people then begin to see from a very different lens. They begin to understand where the positive core and capabilities of the organization lies. So the opportunity to construct a new vision for valuing humanity becomes powerful. So why this model? An organization can hire all the new people you want, invoke all the diversity statements and handbook documents, and engage in all other kinds of structural change. I've seen many gatherings of groups organized around, well, we're going to do something different with regards to diversity in our organization, but the leadership wasn't there. They were trying to push the issues and the change processes from the bottom up. It's important for the leadership to get involved because nothing is more powerful than hearing the human heart. The components of this model are not difficult if there is a commitment to heal the hearts and souls of our work. The tough part is simply putting aside your varying levels of egos. I want to read something very quickly that I wrote in the book also, because I don't want to have people assume that there's not a role for human resources. Human resource personnel and professionals are very critical. So bear with me just 1 second, and then we're done. Human resource professionals have a very important position in designing and implementing strategies within their organization that are focused on moving the organization towards a culture that values humanity. In many respects, they are seen as the drivers of change. Yet, it becomes very difficult to be able to drive change when you don't have the level of alignment. Given the widespread impact of globalization and internationalization, workplace diversity is now a fact of life that's going to continue. Yet, it is truly up to the organization's leadership as to how the organization is with reference to inculcating those values into the core of the organization. But in the midst of organizations making up their minds regarding their position on diversity, current trends in domestic and global workplaces clearly indicate the need for intercultural competence within an organization. Over the course of years, I've worked in HR as well as taught strategic HR management to mid and senior level executives. The one constant I have learned is that HR strategies do not drive and sustain alone the change an organization may be looking for. However, the elements within the proposed model are designed to evoke an organizational change that has the potential to alter critical behaviors within the organization. Leadership, communications, power dynamics, organizational culture, in addition to, most important, how the organization values the differences that lie within its workplace. Therefore, accountability measures and the identification of individuals within the organization will bear the accountability that is critical. Consequently, the need to identify the critical core competencies that will be needed to continue to change culture will be the responsibility of HR, in addition to designing and implementing recruitment and retention strategies that will inspire people to stay within the organization. So in other words, what I'm saying is once you have gone through those 4 stages within the model, HR is critical in being able to then work towards really designing the strategies for institutionalizing that change. As I was coming close to finishing this book, what kept playing in my head and heart was the phrase, "What do you see when you look at me?" And I wondered what people think when they engage in difference. And as challenging as our life is right now, what do we see? Can we see beyond the physical differences into the hearts and souls of people? I do believe, maybe I'm an optimist, but I do believe that if challenged to look at how we have constructed our world, a vast majority of people will change that. Yet I believe people have to be challenged to grow uncomfortable in their paradigms. So as Robert F. Kennedy said, each time someone stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope. We need to embrace that hope and be very conscientious towards bringing forth positive change and now. Because our global villagers, whether they're here in the United States, across the world, or whatever, they're counting on us to be able to make a difference. Questions, comments? Let's see what we have in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Dr. Easley, for the informative session and your expertise. Yes, please, if you have any questions, you can chat them in, or you feel free to unmute and share your question.
I have a question. I'm a big fan of appreciative inquiry, and I was wondering how I don't know if you, my eyes kind of lit up when I saw it on your screen. How did you decide to incorporate that in your model? Like, what's the backstory there, if you will?
We don't, unfortunately, have time for that backstory, Jennifer. I was one of the first people that actually used AI. David Cooperrider was on my doctoral committee, and he actually conducted the first PhD course I took. And my dissertation was focused on the application of appreciative inquiry for kids in gangs. And it was the first application of that strategy, which I'm still getting questions about and comments and invitations to speak. That dissertation and that work using AI was the precipitator of the first book I wrote in 2012. I have been an avid user and supporter of AI with some change reservations. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote an article that was published in the OD Journal that actually challenged whether or not AI should be the precipitating intervention strategy at the beginning of change in an organization. And my response to that, based on very challenged communities my colleague and I had worked in, was that no, you really need to engage in discourse analysis first to be able to understand why there's such deep buried pain in people, and utilize the application of AI then as the opportunity to come in and heal. But unless you dislodge that, it's still going to stay buried even in the midst of AI. And people thought that, you know, David might be a little bit upset with that, but he got it. You know, he understood. In fact, David was using appreciative inquiry, the first person to develop the global leadership compact with the UN. They used AI in their first meeting in 2004 that was spearheaded by him. So I think there's power in it, and I have intentionally, since the pandemic, taught it to just about every class I've had since then, because I think it's critical that we learn how to heal in the midst of the challenges that we're facing right now.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one. And Dr. Easley, I was seeing a lot of emoji clapping here at the end, and a lot of gratitude and thanks for sharing your model with us today from those joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Can this model be applied to higher education as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, higher education was one of the first places that I started testing the model years ago. In the midst of a serious diversity crisis we were having.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for our questions. Again, Dr. Easley, thank you so much for your willingness to share this great information with us today. As many have noted here, of course, it's very relevant, and I think we've all been able to pull a lot away that we can take forth and apply in our lives. So thank you so much.
Well, again,
thank you all for joining.
For the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Okay.